Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lynn Skolnick, and I am a former trustee of the Ethelbert B. Crawford Public Library in Monticello, New York. And we are currently have a local history project underway. And part of that project is an oral history project in which we are interviewing people who have grown up or worked or played in Sullivan County in the library district. We are currently talking to somebody who has not lived in the library area for many years, but who is currently in Chicago, but whose family was very instrumental in politics and business in the library district. Our interview today is January 11th, 2024. Our guest today is Debora DeHoyos. So Debora, before we begin with my questions, I wonder if you could just tell our listeners just a little bit about yourself, where you presently are, maybe your family, whatever you want to give us about your personal life, and then we can go into our questions.
Certainly. Very happy to do it. I live in the Chicago area. I live in Evanston, Illinois, which is a near-in suburb to Chicago. I practice law in Chicago. I have been here since I graduated from law school in 1978. I never expected to live in the Midwest, but I met a Chicagoan in law school who very much wanted to return to the Chicago area. And that's how I ended up here. We have three adult daughters in their 30s. And so in addition to practicing law and some civic engagement, we live vicariously through our daughters.
Good answer. Debora, both sides of your family go back many years in the Sullivan County area, in the Monticello area. Let's start with your father's side of the family. Your father was Louis DeHoyos. His father was Louis DeHoyos before him. But your story goes back even before that. So tell us how far back your story starts and where it starts, or when it starts.
So the story in Monticello for my father's side of the family would begin in around the turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century, around early 1900s, when my great-grandfather, Alois von Isakovics, and his wife, Mary von Isakovics, who was born Mary Upshur Sturgis, moved to Monticello and relocated a business that they had started in New York City, which involved manufacturing perfumes and flavor synthetically. And Alois had come from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I believe he was born in Prague, and had emigrated from there because he wanted to pursue chemistry in the United States rather than a military career back with his family, which the tradition was a military tradition. Got to New York, met Mary, who actually was from originally a family of people some from Virginia, some from Connecticut, but had settled in New York City. And they married, they started their business, and he had tuberculosis. And one of the very customary medical recommendations for someone with tuberculosis in those days was to move to the country, to move to fresh air. And so they left the city, they came to the country, they relocated and expanded their business, and had a family in Monticello, and continued their lives until he died, I think around 1917, probably of tuberculosis. It may have prolonged his life to move to the country, but it didn't ultimately involve a cure. And Mary had a very long life. She lived into the 1960s and continued in
Oh,
Monticello. And so they founded Synfleur. As I mentioned, it was one of the pioneering companies in manufacturing perfumes and flavors in the United States, using not just natural ingredients, but also synthetic ingredients.
is that where the name comes from, Deborah? Synfleur,
So I always assumed
synthetic
so.
flowers?
I think so. Synthetic flowers. I don't. I think it's pretty straightforward.
Okay. And so how did that, tell us how that company grew, what became of it, how many people were employed?
It was never a big business. Um, I think it was probably at its peak, the employer of maybe a couple dozen people. And it didn't really need a big head count to be successful, because what the business would do would be to manufacture concentrates of a perfume or a flavor that it would then sell to the ultimate manufacturer, who would incorporate it in the finished product. And so with something like its biggest product, had only one, during its lifetime, only one famous product, which was the fragrance for Johnson & Johnson's baby powder. And that continued for as long as the family owned the business. In fact, maybe after it was sold as well. What they would do would be, there'd be a day when they would be manufacturing, and they would make a vat of this concentrate and then ship it off to Johnson & Johnson or to whomever was going to be used. The business smelled, to be perfectly honest. If you were in the neighborhood, there was fragrance, and I lived 2 buildings away from it. So I knew that.
I was going to ask you that. Yeah, I thought you lived nearby, across the street.
Yeah. And so on different days, Synfleur would smell like different things depending on what was being made there.
And I told you the story that I had a student in my early years of teaching in the early 70s in Monticello, who worked there after school, who we kind of shoved to the back of the room with the windows open for that very reason.
And there were some summers when I worked in the lab, and depending on what I was doing that day, or whether I had spilled anything, I would have to, upon arriving home, go change my clothes, put them in the washing machine, take a shower, or else I wasn't really fit to live with. So the business continued until at its location on Lakewood Avenue, which was, by the way, for most of those years, still Bedford Avenue, until the mid-1970s, when my father sold the business. He sold it to the Nestle company, and then they resold it to Bell Flavors and Fragrances. And eventually Bell relocated it to Middletown. I have not followed what has happened since then, whether there's still that operation, or whether Bell, which is headquartered in the Chicago suburbs, in fact, what happened to the core Synfleur business. Going back to my family history, in 1917, Alois died, and rather than fold up shop, Mary continued to run the business, and she continued to run it with my grandfather, Louis DeHoyos. So there we get to the DeHoyos side of the family. And he was a Spanish immigrant who had left northern Spain, the province of Cantabria, a tiny little village. All of his siblings had left the village too, One had moved to Madrid and the others moved to either Mexico or the US. He first went to Mexico where he had 3 sisters, and then went from Mexico into the US, joined the Army. I don't know if joining the Army expedited his citizenship. I have his naturalization papers from 1915, when he became a citizen. He had made his way all the way to New York City and answered a want ad that my great-grandfather had put in the paper for an employee. Alois
This was
hired-
Alois.
Yes, it was Alois. It was Alois Sr. Before he died. So my grandfather Luis started working for Alois before Alois died, and continued to work with Mary after Alois died. And my grandfather became my grandfather because he married Alois and Mary's daughter. And as I've told you, Lynn, there's an interesting story about their courtship where my grandmother, who was then Marie von Isakovics, was being courted not only by my grandfather at that point, but by a young doctor in town, Dr. Brakey, Dr. Ralph Brakey, who spent his career and life in Monticello with a
Yes, he
practice
did.
on Broadway. And the story, which I've never heard anything but that it's true, was that one evening they both went to pay a call on Marie, and they were both in the family living room of the von Isakovics household, and my grandmother hadn't yet entered the room, and one of them said to the other, well, which one of us is it going to be? And they flipped a coin, and my grandfather won. It's a lovely story, but I like to think that my grandmother had some agency in this as well, and wasn't simply won in a coin toss. But
It's a great story. Deborah, let me just ask you to move back 1 second. You mentioned that when your great-grandfather died, Mary took over the business. That had to be very unusual that a woman took over a business in those days. Did you ever hear anything about that? Did she run into any problems as a woman, running a business?
So it's a good question, and it falls into the category of questions I wish I'd asked when they were
Okay.
around to answer them. But she was generally regarded as a formidable person. And so it may have been that the strength of her persona was, and the fact that she owned the business meant that people didn't mess with her. I do think that without Alois, who was the scientist and the creative one, I do think that the business probably never reached the potential that it might have had he lived. And that there was more maintaining the business than growing it into something bigger. But during my lifetime, since my father wasn't a chemist and he was running the business, and his father hadn't been a chemist when he ran the business, they always hired perfume and flavor chemists to be the creative types and to come up with a product to sell to the customers. So Mary and Luis ran the business until Alois Jr., who was known as Buddy, was intended to take it over. And I think he always worked in the business as well. The tragedy was that Buddy died very young. He died at the age of, I think, 40. In something like 1947, I'm not sure whether it was appendicitis gone wrong or something like that. It was not a long illness. It was a short illness, and very tragic death. He was a young man with a family, and he was the intended person to run the business. Didn't happen. Fortunately, my grandfather was there, and my father had just finished college, and the two of them ran the business until my grandfather died in the early 1950s, I think 51. And then my father ran it until he sold it in the mid 1970s.
Deborah, was that your dad's intention when he finished school? Did he say, "I'm going to go back in and run the family business"?
No, I think he always wanted to be a lawyer. I think I may possibly be the projection of his ambition.
I was going to say, you're fulfilling the dream.
But it wasn't just that my grandfather and grandmother depended upon the business for their support. It also always provided financial support, although not complete financial support, for my Aunt Rosa. Her name was Rosa O'Carroll. She was married to Marty O'Carroll, and they had a family in Monticello. And my Aunt Nana, Johanna Austin, who was married to Sid Austin, who worked for Sinfleur. And there were a lot of other families who depended upon Sinfleur for their livelihood. So I think my father felt a sense of responsibility.
Deborah, when you said that in the summers when you would work at the company, what kinds of jobs did you do there?
Totally menial. In fact, my uncle, who on my mother's side, who was an accountant, had to tell my father that he had to pay me minimum wage because he was paying me less than minimum wage. I tended to work in the perfume lab and do menial tasks there. To give you an idea of how menial, in a perfume lab, there are, at least in those days, there were hundreds of bottles labeled with small bottles labeled with what the ingredients were that could be measured out in grams on a scale very precisely to try to create new formulas. I got to pour from big bottles into little bottles and put labels on those bottles when I was in high school because that was work that needed to be done. I had taken typing the summer before 9th grade in summer school, which was something that lots of people did in those days. They took typing in the summer before 9th grade. And so occasionally I got to type a letter or a memo or something like that. So I was basically a person who did things that needed to be done that nobody else wanted to do. And I did
Deborah,
this
I just found out, I just heard this week that the attic, Sinfleur is now the home of United Way, but I just heard this week that in the attic are old bottles of chemicals. And I'm thinking those should be gone, that someone should go in there and take those over. So we're in the process, Myron is in the process of contacting them to let them know that some of those bottles you poured from one to the other may still be up there in the attic.
They may still be up there. That would have been, it was Bell that vacated the premises. And when they vacated the premises, they contacted me and said they had found things that were the families in the attic. So that building where United Way is now was not only the Sinfleur headquarters, but the front part of it was the family home of Alois and Mary and their children for many years until they moved out to other houses in the neighborhood. And so what they found in the attic were things like children's clothing, little dresses that my grandmother and her sisters would have worn in the early 1900s. Um,
Wow. Did they save them?
yeah, I have them.
Oh, great.
I have them. And I have a bunch of old books and things like that. And uh, when my when I finally went through my parents' house, there were a lot of papers that had been moved from Synfleur over to my parents' basement. And I found some interesting things like a letter to Alois from Thomas Edison.
Wow.
And it was because I believe Alois was the corresponding secretary for the American Chemical Society in its early days. And the letter, the substance of the letter is basically, Dear Mr. von Isakovich, I won't be able to attend the meeting. Sincerely, Thomas Edison. But it's still a letter from Thomas Edison.
Absolutely.
Um,
That's great. So he was he was the head of this organization on a national level.
well, that sounds a little grandiose for probably what it was at the time.
Because it wasn't
He wasn't the head of it. He was, I believe, the secretary for a while.
secretary.
I believe it was, you know, the sort of um, thing that one does as part of being part of the industry. And, you know, part of the study of chemistry. He apparently gave lectures at Columbia University on the chemistry of flavors and creating complex synthetic flavors. And so he had a reasonably high profile for his time.
Okay. Thank you. So when your father was in charge of the business, that wasn't his only job, though. Tell us about his other endeavors.
So both my father and my grandfather served as mayor of Monticello. And it's probably more remarkable that my grandfather did because for a recent Spanish immigrant to land in town, and he really had no education. He came from a remote rural area, and for him to become the mayor of the town, it says something about him. It probably also says something very good about the community. That Monticello was
I love that you include that.
yeah, Monticello was as accepting of a non-traditional candidate as they appeared to be. I never knew him. He died about 2 years before I was born, but he was apparently a natural politician. It's the sort of person who changed the chemistry of the room when he walked into it. You know, it was
No pun intended.
no pun intended. Because he wasn't the chemist, but in any event, no pun intended, given the family business. And so he served twice as mayor. He was elected, and then at some point he was defeated, and then he ran again and was elected. And he was serving as mayor when he died in the early 1950s. He wasn't very old. I think he was 57 and had a heart attack. And so I think he loved the job. And then whether it was family tradition or a sense of civic duty, my father also ran for mayor. He served 2 terms, I think. He was mayor for 8 years. He was ultimately defeated by 8 votes by Joe Garlick.
Okay.
And that was not my father's last elective office. His last elective office was in the 1960s. New York State had a constitutional convention to rewrite the New York State Constitution. And my father was elected as a delegate to that. And that convention met in Albany for a year's time. They eventually came up with a constitution that was defeated at the polls. So
was that an appointment by the governor?
no, I think he was elected.
Oh, elected. You did say that. Who was? Do you know who was governor at the time?
Those were the Rockefeller years, I think. When did Rockefeller first become governor? Nelson Rockefeller.
During my time in New York, which started in '69, but I don't know exactly at what point.
Right.
That's what I think, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, Rockefeller was governor for a long time. I mean, but it's a knowable fact. I could go back and see.
And
But
I was
I'm
just curious.
pretty sure it was Rockefeller. Um, and I'm pretty sure it was an elected position, but it may have been appointed. And ultimately, that constitution, and I don't know what the issues were, but it was defeated at the polls.
Oh,
And then my father's other public appointment, and this was a public appointment from the governor or maybe whatever the New York State Department of Education is called, was he was one of the early or initial trustees at the founding of Sullivan County Community College. And of all of the things he did in public life, I think he liked that the most. He loved education. He loved the idea that Sullivan County would have a community college. He wanted it to be a place of distinction. He was very active in planning for the physical premises. He was an advocate for a particular location in the county, which I believe was in Bethel. Not successful, but that was a big deal to him, that it would be in a good spot. And then I believe the architect for some of the original buildings was Edward Durrell Stone, who is a prominent architect. And I think that having a lovely location, good buildings, conducive to learning was very important to him. He really wanted this to be something distinctive for Sullivan County.
and I know at one time there was a concern. They wanted the location to be what was called Dillon Farms, and then they finally arrived at the site in Loch Sheldrake. And that still has controversy because of public transportation and all those kinds of things. But I have to say that education and of course libraries have always been my passions. And so that makes my heart feel good. Do you remember while your father was mayor, were there any hot issues at that time, or um, uh, do you know what was going on politically in the area?
Not really. The context, I think, was this was still a time when the resort industry was booming. Broadway was a very lively place. Every storefront was
Yes.
filled. And there was a lot of development going on. It was during those years, I believe, that houses started to be built on Colonial Hill. There was a skating rink that was inaugurated. I remember this on Broadway, up on the west end of Broadway. The school system was separate, of course, from the municipal government, but that's when Rutherford School and Cook School were built. So I think that the mayor's job and the city government, the village government at that point was very focused on growth and development. I do not remember. I was a small child, but I don't remember particular controversies at that point. But I could have just missed them.
When you were in high school, the new building had already been built, so you spent all 4 years in the building on Port Jervis Road?
I was in the first class to go all the way through it.
Oh, okay. And then you were probably in the middle school.
Grade.
Okay, you were in middle school prior to that. And where did you go to elementary school?
So I'm a baby boomer, and therefore the facilities in my early childhood were inadequate. I went to kindergarten in the building on the corner of St. John Street and Bedford Avenue, and in the old part, in the Bedford Avenue part. And then I went to first grade in the telephone building annex.
Oh, so you were involved in the telephone building as well?
Yes. And then by second grade, Cook and Rutherford schools had opened.
Oh,
And
okay.
so then I went to second grade at Cook School, second through sixth. And then back to seventh grade in the old high school building, middle school building on St. John Street,
Yeah.
Bedford Avenue, which at that point had 7 through 12 in it.
Yes.
And we were on staggered schedules, because there was just no room to have 6 grades in there at the same time. And so the high school started early and the middle school started late.
Okay.
So that was my middle school experience. And then ninth grade, we were at the new high school.
Okay. Um, While your father was mayor, that's when the urban renewal came through the area. Is that correct? When he was mayor, that the part of Broadway closest to Jefferson Street, I think a lot of that was renovated at that time. Do you recall that?
Vaguely. I think that's
Okay.
correct.
Okay.
But it wasn't part of my childhood memories.
Okay. Okay. Let's go to your mom's side of the family if we can. Tell us about your mom's family. They also were in the area for many years.
Yes. My mother's maiden name was Kinney. She was the daughter of Wilhelmina Rambor Kinney and Philip Kinney. And I know less. I can go back probably farther, but not as many branches of the tree for them. So my mother was born in Bridgeville, in the building that became the old Homestead Restaurant in Bridgeville. But when she was born there, it was the Hotel Kinney, and it was operated by her parents. She was the youngest of 5 children, and they had, I think, a nice little business there. They had regular people who came up in the summer, families, and stayed there. And it was right on the shores of the Neversink. And my mother describes this really rather idyllic childhood of, essentially, when she wasn't in school, she and her brothers and sisters were playing on the river. They were swimming in it in the summer, and they were skating on it or sledding down to it or whatever in the winter. And so that was the everything I heard about her childhood. Her father died when she was quite young, and then it was just her mother who ran the business and raised 5 children, and until she sold it to the Edelman family, who opened the old homestead.
Do you know about when that was?
The sale was in the late 1940s. And then they opened the restaurant there. The Wilhelmina, I can go one stage back for Wilhelmina, one level back. I can't for Philip. Her parents were August Rambor and Abby Simpson. And August Rambor was an immigrant from Bavaria who came to the United States in 1852. He was a clockmaker, and I don't know how it was that he got from Bavaria to Monticello. Maybe there were other German immigrants there. Maybe he heard that there was no watchmaker or watch repair shop in town, and he made his way there. And he'd been living in Monticello 10 years when he enlisted in the Union Army. So he was in the Sullivan County Regiment in the Union Army. And the position he held was called principal musician, which was a non-commissioned officer position. I have not been able yet to find records, if they exist, as to whether he was a bugler or a drummer but it was through basically drumming and bugling that battlefield commands were communicated during the Civil War. And so it was a responsible position. I don't think he was, I don't think it meant that he was back in camp playing inspirational marches. That regiment, I think, had an interesting war. I think they spent a lot of the time guarding Washington because there was always a worry about invasion. But then they were part of Sherman's army that marched through the South and through Georgia to the sea. And then they went back to Washington. And fortunately, my great-grandfather survived battle and disease. I think, more people in that regiment died from disease than from battle. And he was mustered out in 1865. Came back to Monticello, got married to a woman quite a bit younger than he was, named Abby Simpson. And they had 2 children, Wilhelmina and Carl. And Abby died when she was 30, leaving, August basically to raise the children for the next 20 years or so. And he had a shop on Broadway. If you Google him or search for him in the archives for probably the Republican Watchman and its predecessor paper, you'll see things like ads for the shop or notices of something going on with respect to the shop.
It's interesting you mentioned the Republican Watchman. One of the other people that we recently interviewed is a man named Robert Schock. Robert Schock graduated from Monticello. He was a scientist. He went on to earn a Nobel Peace Prize that he shared. He and some fellow chemists shared with Al Gore on global warming. And the reason I bring this up, his wife, Susan, and I can't think of her, she just died recently. I can't think of her last name. Her family owned the Republican Watchman.
Okay.
And so a lot of the archives from the newspaper are now housed in the Sullivan County Museum in Hurleyville. So that might be a place to do some additional research. But it's interesting how so many of the people that we have been interviewing have some sort of a connection, 6 degrees or more. But it's interesting.
It was a small town. And I haven't really made a study of those old archives to the extent they're online, but I've occasionally dipped in and just Googled a family member's name or searched a family member's name to see what I could find. And the old papers are charming. They talk about young people. There was one that talked about young people from Monticello in the winter taking a sleigh ride down to Bridgeville to visit with one of my mother's sisters. You get a sense of what the life was like then. That's very enjoyable.
So the road where the now homestead or the old homestead was, where your family's hotel was, that was not a paved road, the one that parallels what's now the Route 17 or the Quickway? When you say they took a sleigh ride down there,
I don't know when it was first paved.
Okay.
There are some photographs from the early 20th century, mostly there so that you can see the covered bridge, because the bridge over the Neversink was this great old covered bridge that was built, I don't know, was it built in the 1830s, something like that?
Wow. Okay.
And it was eventually taken down. And the road, it looks like a very established road. It looks like it was used a lot.
Okay.
But you can't really see, I couldn't see any pavement on it.
Okay. All
I've
right.
never asked myself that question. It's an interesting one.
Okay. So, just if you don't mind, and I suppose because you did mention it, your father and your mother, they didn't have any coin flips when they got married, when they got together,
No.
like his father. Okay. So, what
Well,
was
there was
life like?
whether you edit this out or not, there is a great story of the proposal, which is that they had been going out for 5 years. Now, it's a small town, but to make it even smaller, my mother was then living with her mother and probably some other family members on Lake Street. And my father was living with his family. I think his father was still alive. His younger sister was there, his mother, on the corner of Lake Street and Lakewood Avenue in what was then One Lakewood. It's no longer One Lakewood because they changed Oakley Avenue to be
Right.
in Lakewood. And so my father could see the front door of my mother's house from his bedroom window. And as the story goes, my mother had said basically, Lou, I need a decision. Are we getting married or not? And if we're not getting married, I'm going to start seeing other men. So he equivocated. And I guess she started dating other men. And one night, he's looking out his window. He sees a gentleman caller pick her up and take her out somewhere. He follows them to a restaurant where the two of them are sitting and eating, walks over to the table and says, "You win, Marion." And that was the proposal.
Great story. So, Deborah, tell our listeners, what are your recollection? What was life like for you growing up in Monticello, presumably in the 60s for the most part, late 50s, early
I was
60s?
born in 53. I left for college in 71. But I kept coming back for summers. I graduated from law school in 78, and that was when I moved to Chicago. I feel really, really lucky to have grown up in Monticello and grown up in Monticello when I did. I mean, it's such a specific slice of American culture during those years. It was the heyday of the resort industry in the eastern part of Sullivan County. Um, it was both a thriving community, but very close knit, probably because the tourists all left. They left us our town from Labor Day until maybe Memorial Day or the 4th of
Yeah.
July. So the place was pretty crazy in the summer. Traffic, the supermarket, etc., was all pretty crazy in the summer. And that was the economic lifeblood of the place. But then we had a nice small town the rest of the year, which was close-knit and supportive. I believe I got a good education in the Monticello public school system. I'm grateful to it. I'm grateful for having grown up in a small town because in a small town, you can't avoid any particular segment of the community. You interact with everybody. And I think that served me well for my whole life. And, there's now a lot of cultural interest in what the Borscht Belt was in its heyday. And that's charming to me, but to me, it's more than charming. It's what my life was. And it was what my youth was. And so I feel very fortunate, and I still have good friends that I went to school with, and I think we all benefited from it.
That's interesting. I think that so many people, there is this renewed interest in the Borscht Belt, but it was a way of life and a unique way of life for many people. So many businesses and schools and everything were influenced in some way by that culture. But the more people I talk to and the people we interview, everyone tells us pretty much the same thing, Deborah, that they're still in touch with some of their high school friends and that it served them well. And I used to always ask former students when they came back, how did your education stand up to your classmates at Georgetown or some of the big universities? And I remember several times people telling me that because it was a community school, there wasn't a school for the suburb people or the White Lake people or the Rock Hill, everyone went to the same school. That became a much more culturally diverse situation than many kids who grew up in suburban Evanston or other suburban areas got to experience, and that it served them well when they did leave the area. And so that's always interesting to hear. One of the questions I had asked, had written was, did you make a conscious decision to leave the area? But you explained that when you said that you met somebody who wanted to go back to Chicago.
Right. I had not thought that I would end up in the Midwest. I did think I would end up in a city because the type of law I was interested in practicing was more of a city practice. But I figured it would be New York or Washington. I didn't think I'd end up in the Midwest, but I did. And you know, as I've mentioned to you before, I live 2 blocks away and work closely with someone whose family was from Callicoon and who now has a business in Callicoon. And the law school classmate who introduced my husband and me, by total coincidence, ended up marrying Laura Schenk Miller, whose family had Schenk's Paramount, and they live in Evanston, not very far from us, and they were over at the house on New Year's Eve. And so I don't feel separated from Monticello or Sullivan County.
As we start to wrap up here, Deborah, is there a question you wish I had asked you that I failed to ask you?
I think you got my best stories.
You gave us some good ones. You sure did. Both your father and your grandfather, they were quite the guy.
They were characters. They were characters. I would also say that one of the advantages of being in a small town that was still a small town, but had people coming to it and you know, every summer from the outside world, mostly New York City, but still the outside world, was Monticello was not a culturally isolated place. I think some small towns that are more remote can be culturally isolated, but Monticello wasn't. So I really feel that we were getting the best of small town life with a much broader view on the world. So I continue to feel very lucky about the experience.
And culturally, when you were living here as a kid, did you take advantage of the proximity to New York City? Or
always. My parents would like to go into New York a couple times a year with me. And so some of that was shopping. That was before the malls opened up, and some of it was shopping, some of it was going to shows and museums. I remember going to the Museum of Natural History and seeing the dinosaur for the first time. I remember going to the Bronx Zoo, which was going to be my first zoo trip, and arriving at the gates and finding out that the employees were on strike and crying because I wanted to go to a zoo. But no, I remember riding the bus in New York and things, taking the short line. So yes, it was not considered remote
because of that access, certainly. And your family did go on to have an interest in art, and that's an interest that you still have today.
Right. And my father loved to travel, and my mother enjoyed it once she got on the trip.
Yeah.
she was always difficult to motivate to do it, but once she was on the trip, she enjoyed it and she loved having stories when she came back.
Well, that's great. Deborah, I want to thank you so much for your willingness to share so much with us and to take your time. We will be posting this soon. I send it once I get back from the cloud. I send it. So I'm going to stop the recording. If you would just stay on for a second, I'd
Sure.
really appreciate it.
Will do.
Thank you so much. Whoops.